There are some moments that don't announce themselves, that don't stand under spotlights or arrive with the predictable clink of wine glasses and formal introductions. They happen quietly, under the hum of air conditioning, or the dull chatter of strangers, and they stay. It was raining the afternoon Julian first saw her, though saw was the wrong word, because it wasn't just sight, it was the way his attention snagged on her, the way a sleeve catches on a loose nail. He had been sitting in the corner of the café near campus, half listening to the hiss of the espresso machine, his laptop open to a paper he wasn't writing, when she walked in with her umbrella held at an awkward angle, her hair damp in that unbothered way that suggested she had stopped caring about appearances long before she stepped through the door. Her face was striking, but not in the polished, magazine-slick way. There was something unedited about her, as if life had left its handwriting in the faint lines around her eyes and the way she tilted her head when scanning for an empty table. Julian, 23, and in the middle of his own collection of half-lived years, found himself studying her without realizing he had stopped typing. She wore a navy trench coat, its belt loosely tied, and a pair of scuffed leather boots that looked as though they had weathered more than rain. He wondered if she was a professor, or maybe just passing through, because the café sat between the university and the part of town where people pretended their mortgages hadn't aged them. She sat by the window with a book and actual paper and ordered tea instead of coffee, which seemed almost like an act of rebellion in a place that reeked of espresso. She didn't glance at anyone. She didn't care to. It was the smallest thing that made him approach her, an accident, really. When he got up to leave, his bag strap caught on the chair beside her, sending her paper napkin fluttering to the floor. He picked it up before she could, and she looked at him then, a look not of gratitude but of curiosity, as if she were trying to measure the point of his interruption. She had brown eyes, warm but wary, like they had been taught too many times to expect the wrong thing. He handed her the napkin and said something so unremarkable he forgot it immediately, but she smiled, not the polite smile of strangers in shared space, but a small, crooked thing that looked like it had fought its way through a year of storms. That was the part that lodged itself in him, the way her expression shifted from guarded to almost unwillingly softened, as though she hadn't been given a reason to do it in a very long time. They didn't exchange names. Not then. But the next day he saw her again, in the same café, at the same table, with a different book. He nodded as he passed, and she nodded back, and something unspoken settled between them. On the third day, he broke the silence by making a comment about her book, something about how the author had been criticized for romanticizing loneliness. She looked at him like she was trying to decide if he meant it as a joke or an insult. "Some things," she said, "are worth romanticizing. Loneliness can be one of them." Her voice had a textured calm to it, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned to speak only when she had something worth saying. Over the next week, they talked in fragments. He learned her name, Elena, when she offered it in a way that suggested she didn't give it out easily. She learned his when he apologized for being late one afternoon, rain again dripping from his hair. She didn't ask what he studied, and he didn't ask what she did for work. Their conversations were about books, the weather, the absurdity of cafe playlists, and occasionally the kinds of things you only admit to strangers, things too sharp or strange to tell the people who think they know you. It was a Thursday when the moment came that would stay in him like a secret. She was reading when a group of loud students entered, filling the space with the entitled noise of people who had never considered the possibility of being alone. One of them, a tall boy with a laugh like breaking glass, noticed her and said something under his breath that made the others snicker. Julian heard it. So did she. She didn't look up, but he saw the way her shoulders tightened, the smallest bracing. Without thinking, he got up, walked over to the counter, and ordered a second tea, the same as hers. When it came, he set it in front of her without explanation, without looking at the group, and sat back down at his table as if that had been his plan all along. She stared at the cup for a long moment before lifting her eyes to his. That was when it happened, her smile, not a quick flicker this time, but something real, something that didn't stop at her mouth. It was slow, hesitant at first, then stronger, like a muscle remembering it could move. And for reasons Julian couldn't yet explain, it felt like the most important thing he had done in years. The days after the tea became a pattern that neither of them acknowledged with any contract or promise because it felt safer to let it grow on its own terms, so they met in the same cafe and sometimes in the park where the ground stayed dry under a canopy of tired trees, and they talked about music and cities they had visited and the ways work pulled at their hours even when they tried to shut it out. And when Julian finally asked what Elena did with her days, she told him she handled communications for a local arts foundation that depended on donors who liked their names on plaques and their reputations spotless. And when she asked what he studied, he told her political science with a minor in statistics because he wanted a path that could pay rent without stealing the part of him that liked to write late at night. And neither of them used the word dating because that word carried expectations they could not afford to trigger. At first, the difference in their ages sat between them as an unmeasured risk that they skirted without saying so, but when the university term picked up and campus got louder, the risk took a shape they could not ignore, because the café drew students who fed on rumor and insisted on turning guesswork into posts that traveled faster than truth. And the second time a pair of undergrads glanced between their table and their phones, Julian felt the small punch of it, and Elena noticed and folded her hands around her cup to stop her fingers from tapping, and they kept talking while both calculated damage and decided that the cost of leaving felt worse than the cost of staying. He carried his own dents into those afternoons, the kind that people in their early 20s try to hide under jokes, because his last relationship had ended with a quiet betrayal that he pretended did not cut deep, a classmate who had asked to read his drafts and then passed off his arguments as her own in a campus journal while also sleeping with a friend he trusted, and he had swallowed the humiliation and told no one because filing a complaint would have required a public confrontation, and he was not ready to drag his work and his private life into a room full of judges, so he took the loss and told himself that none of it mattered, except that it did, and Elena saw it in the way he tightened when the topic surfaced. She carried a different history that did not fit into a short explanation, a marriage that had lasted 11 years and then collapsed under the weight of a partner who admired her independence until it meant she would not chair his committees or host his colleagues or accept his need to control every weekend, and when she found the string of messages that proved what she suspected, she left without a scene and rebuilt her life in a small apartment with white walls and new locks, and she told no one at work because the foundation loved a neat story and a neat face, and donors liked to think the people who managed their events lived steady lives with orderly dinners, so she curated her own quiet and kept her circle small. They did not set rules about public spaces, but they learned to keep a margin of safety, so they sat near corners and avoided the campus bar and used side streets when they walked, and when he texted her he removed last names and used initials for locations, and when she saved his number she did not add a surname, and when they wanted to laugh they moved their chairs closer and lowered their voices, and when they touched it was not in the cafe but in the park when dusk gave consent and a row of parked cars made a wall, and those small acts felt like protests against the noise that insisted people should pair with mirror images, and age differences meant imbalance and danger, and it would have been easier to step away, but neither of them wanted the kind of ease that came from forfeiting what made the day feel honest. The social barrier formed invisible steps that became a slope, beginning with an anonymous post on a student forum that speculated about a woman with a navy coat who met a younger man in the cafe near the economics building, a post that did not use names but hinted at a faculty connection she did not have, then followed by a thread where other students added unverified sightings because telling stories gave them a brief rush, and Julian ignored it for a day and then saw his own classmates sharing the link with laughing emojis, and he closed the app and put his phone face down and said nothing to Elena until she noticed the weight in his eyes and asked if something had happened, and he told her the basics without drama because he did not want to push his anxiety onto her, and she listened with stillness and then told him that she did not want to be a reason he feared his own hallways. "I can handle noise," he said, and he meant it more than he expected, because he had handled worse, and he wanted the choice to be his. "I can handle it too," she said, "but my work is not built to absorb gossip, and I can lose contracts if donors decide my life is messy." "What do you want to do?" he asked, and he braced for an answer that might end what they had started without admitting it was an ending. "I want to keep what is ours and starve the rumor by giving it nothing to feed on," she said, "and I want to make sure we do not hide so much that we stop living." They created a plan that satisfied neither of them but kept them moving: fewer cafe afternoons and more late-night conversations by phone, walks on streets that sat between neighborhoods where they were unlikely to meet acquaintances, small arrangements that brought relief and also a new kind of vigilance, and when he stayed over for the first time it was because the bus had stopped running and the rain had washed away the hour, and they slept with the window open and woke to a simple breakfast that tasted of relief rather than fantasy, and in the morning he left early and texted when he reached the corner because she had asked him to confirm a safe exit. Family entered in a way they could not schedule because his sister, who lived 2 towns away and visited when classes overwhelmed him, stopped by the cafe one afternoon and saw Elena across the room with her book and her tea, and later asked a line of questions that sounded like concern but carried an undertone of judgment, Because she had absorbed the idea that age gaps were traps and wanted to protect him by pushing him back into familiar lanes, and he told her that he understood the risk and that he had chosen it, and she frowned and told him that choosing a risk did not make it smaller, and he nodded and said he would keep his own counsel. The pressure reached a point that felt like a test when the foundation hosted a small donor reception on campus and Elena had to attend because her role demanded it, and Julian knew to avoid the building yet could not stop himself from walking past the square at the edge to see if she looked overwhelmed, and she did not see him, which was good, but someone else did, a student photographer for the campus paper who recognized him from seminars and followed his gaze to the lit windows and took a picture of the crowd as part of a gallery he planned to post, and while none of this was proof of anything, it fed a narrative that could grow teeth if given time. The climax came not from a headline but from a phone call that arrived late the next night when they were on a call of their own, discussing a rumor about a new café in a different part of town, and Elena's phone lit up with a number she did not recognize, and she sent it to voicemail and then received a text from the same number that said the campus paper wanted a comment on a tip about her relationship with a student and that they planned to run a piece about inappropriate liaisons between community professionals and undergraduates unless sources were refuted, and she read it twice and forwarded it to him, and his own phone buzzed seconds later with a different number that asked for a statement and hinted at names, and the room around each of them went quiet in a way that did not belong tonight, and for a long moment neither of them spoke because any word felt like a trigger that could set off a chain they could not control. They agreed not to respond immediately to the messages because doing so would confirm that the numbers reached the right people, and instead they each deleted the unknown contacts and sent brief emails to the campus paper's public address saying they had no comment on unnamed tips, which made it harder for anyone to build a coherent story without evidence. But the tension did not fade because both knew that rumors rarely needed proof to become accepted in small circles. Julian stopped going to the café for 2 weeks and used the time to work on assignments in the library, choosing a far corner near the archives where students rarely wandered, while Elena took longer walks home after work, avoiding the main streets that passed the university gates. The distance created its own discomfort, so they compensated with long calls at night where they talked about neutral things at first: recipes, news stories, films they had both seen, and then about the parts of their days that they could not explain to anyone else, the comments overheard at work, the glances in lecture halls, the quiet calculation of whether they were imagining hostility or measuring it accurately. One night after midnight, when the city outside had gone still enough that even the occasional car seemed louder, Elena admitted that she felt more alive than she had in years despite the scrutiny, and she did not mean alive in the sense of excitement or escape but in the sense that her choices were her own again, and Julian said he understood because he had been moving through his days as though they were tasks on a list rather than moments to be lived until this had made him notice what hours could hold when someone was worth the risk. They spoke without rushing, with long pauses that let the words sit between them, and at one point he asked if she thought they were being reckless, and she said that living under someone else's idea of safety was its own kind of recklessness. They began to meet again, carefully, first in places where the chance of being seen by someone they knew was low, such as a bookstore on the far edge of downtown where the aisles were narrow and the staff barely looked at customers, and then in a dim bar on a weeknight where the music was low enough to talk without raising their voices. On one of those nights, a man in his 50s walked in wearing a jacket with the emblem of a donor organization connected to Elena's work, and they both saw him at the same moment. She shifted slightly so her face was in shadow, and they kept their conversation steady while she quietly checked her phone to see if any new messages had arrived. The man ordered a drink, stayed 15 minutes, and left without glancing their way, and they both felt the release only after the door closed. The witness who finally brought the tension into sharper focus appeared in a way neither of them had prepared for. They were leaving a late movie at an independent theater, walking toward the back lot where the crowd was thinner, when Julian noticed a tall figure leaning against the wall near the alley exit, holding a camera loosely at his side. At first he thought it was just another patron waiting for someone, but as they passed, the man raised the camera, pressed the shutter twice, and lowered it without speaking. Elena kept walking without looking back, and Julian matched her pace, his pulse quickening as he realized he recognized the man from campus events, an amateur photographer who contributed to student publications and had a reputation for chasing images that could stir interest online. Once they were in the car, Julian asked if she wanted to confront him or at least request the images be deleted, but she shook her head and said that approaching would only confirm his assumption that he had caught something worth pursuing. They drove in silence for several blocks before she added that they had to accept that the circle of people who suspected something was now wider and included those who saw advantage in proving it. He agreed but could not shake the sense that their margin of safety had narrowed again, and for the next few days he checked social media more than usual, searching for posts that might include their faces. Nothing appeared immediately, which was both a relief and a warning, because it meant the photographs could be held until the right moment for maximum effect. Despite the unease, their calls at night grew longer. They spoke about what they might do if the story broke openly, whether they would confirm it or deny it, and each time the question came up, Elena said she needed to consider the impact on her job, while Julian said he would stand by whatever decision she made, which she appreciated but also told him was not a burden he should carry without thought. He began to write more during this period, short essays and observations that he did not show anyone, and she returned to sketching in the evenings, something she had abandoned after her marriage ended, as though the creative habits they each regained were another way to insist that the intrusion into their lives would not erase what they valued. One evening, they met at a quiet diner just outside the city, and while they ate, a couple in the booth behind them argued in low but heated tones about trust and privacy, the words drifting over in fragments. Elena glanced toward them once, then looked back at Julian and said that sooner or later every relationship becomes about what each person is willing to risk to keep it intact, and he said that he thought they had already answered that, at least for now. She smiled in a way that acknowledged both the truth and the uncertainty in his words, and they finished their meal without returning to the topic. The elusive witness who had taken their picture remained silent in the weeks that followed, but the knowledge of his existence lingered in the back of their minds, shaping the way they moved through public spaces. Julian began to walk a few steps behind or ahead when they left buildings, not because they were ashamed but because it allowed them to avoid framing themselves together in photographs. Elena adjusted her commute so that her departure times varied, making it harder for anyone to anticipate her routine. These changes were small, almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, yet they altered the texture of their days enough to remind them constantly that their connection was being lived under observation, however sporadic. Their nighttime conversations became a space where they could speak without measuring every word, where they could return to the easy rhythm of their early meetings, and in those hours the outside pressure seemed to fade, even if only temporarily. But beneath the comfort was the shared awareness that the fragile balance they maintained could tilt with a single image, a single name, or a single careless moment that gave the people watching what they wanted. The week of the Regional Arts and Civic Philanthropy Conference arrived with schedules that stretched longer than either of them liked and with an undercurrent that neither named because naming it would have turned the week into a countdown, since Elena's foundation was hosting the opening plenary in the university auditorium and her name sat on the program as the person delivering the welcome and moderating a panel on trust between institutions and the communities they serve, while Julian's department had assigned a contingent of students to run microphones and manage seating because the university liked to display interdepartmental cooperation when donors filled the seats, and he had taken the assignment after trying to trade it and failing, deciding that attending and moving like a shadow would be safer than pretending to be sick and risking questions from his advisor about reliability. The secret that moved from private to almost public did not come from a slip but from a visit 2 nights before the conference when Elena's colleague, Mara, stopped by to drop off printed programs and saw Julian's jacket hanging on a chair, paused just long enough for the recognition to register without a word, and then looked at Elena with a mixture of concern and fatigue that comes from understanding the cost of a story before it becomes one, and in the quiet that followed Elena chose not to pretend the jacket belonged to a cousin or a neighbor because she had once promised herself never to insult her own intelligence again, so she told Mara that she was seeing someone and that he was a student but not her student and that they were both adults and that discretion had been their attempt to survive the low appetite for nuance that governed public judgment, which Mara accepted with a long breath and then said that she would not betray a confidence but that the risk at the conference would be higher than usual because she had already seen the campus photographer on the media list and had heard that the campus paper planned to send a reporter to scout for color rather than substance. Julian made his own choice the next day when he took the afternoon train to see his sister because he did not want her to learn their news from a photo posted by a stranger, and in the small kitchen where they had grown up arguing about who would wash the dishes he sat across from Eva and explained that he was with someone older, that she was kind and direct and that he chose her with a clear head, and that the rumors she had seen were about them, and that if Eva wanted to walk away from this conversation he would not hold it against her, and she listened without interrupting, stirring a pan on the stove until the sauce almost reduced to nothing before turning off the burner and saying that she was angry at a world that would make his life harder for a choice that harmed no one and that she was scared for him because she knew how quickly people decided someone else's life told them everything they needed to know, and then she told him that she would stand with him and that she would not repeat any of it, and then she asked to meet Elena when the timing made sense, and when he hugged her he felt the relief of not holding the whole weight alone. The day of the conference opened with stage managers in headset chatter and a lobby smelling of brewed coffee and printed paper, and Elena arrived early to run through queues while Julian took a badge that said volunteer in a route that kept him mostly in the aisles, and for the first hour they moved in separate orbits that were close enough to be felt but not seen, and the session before the panel Elena would moderate was an innocuous presentation on grant-making metrics that ended with polite applause, and then the lights shifted and the room filled again as donors returned from the lobby and the campus photographer took a position near the front with a lens that looked capable of reading expressions more than 20 rows back, which made Julian adjust his placement by 3 steps even though he had told himself not to let the man's presence govern his movement. When Elena walked on stage, the room registered the authority of her posture and the even tone of her voice, and she spoke about access and trust and the necessity of building programs that did not treat communities as credit lines for institutional virtue, and the panelists nodded and added their own examples, and for a while the conversation held the room. The turn came during the audience questions when a student at the microphone announced that his question was about accountability and personal conduct, and Elena nodded because that fit the panel's scope, and then the student asked what institutions intended to do about relationships that compromised the perception of integrity when staff or affiliates became involved with students, and before Elena could answer, the auditorium screen behind her flickered as the photographer, whose feeds were connected for slideshow use in earlier sessions, pushed a live frame under the guise of showing community images, and for a full 3 seconds the screen showed the photograph from the alley outside the theater where Elena and Julian walked close enough that even a nervous eye would call it intimate, and the room reacted with a sharp intake of attention that spread row by row as people registered the faces, and the moderator from the previous session stood up in confusion, and someone in the back called for the screen to be cut, and a technician scrambled to switch inputs while the image remained long enough to become undeniable. Mara, standing at the side, looked at Elena with a small tilt of the head that asked a question without pressing it, and Julian stood still in the aisle and felt every gaze slide past him and then return, because recognition moves quickly when the room wants a focal point. Elena had seconds to choose between the path of deflection that would preserve deniability and the path of admission that would likely damage her role but honor the reality she had built with him, and while 1,000 arguments flashed in her mind about timing and strategy and how donors think in headlines rather than specifics, she realized that the story would not wait and that waiting would not make the impact softer, so she stepped toward the lectern and told the room that an image had been shown without consent and that the people in the image were adults engaged in a private relationship that involved no professional power dynamics, no exchange of favors, and no violations of policy, and that any institution that claimed to value community had an obligation to resist the instinct to reduce lives to gossip, and she said that if the foundation believed her private life interfered with her role then she would resign rather than let the organization be dragged through a dispute about optics, but that she would not apologize for building something honest after years of making decisions that served other people's narratives. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind that welcomes contemplation but the highly focused kind that accompanies shock when a room realizes it is watching a line being drawn in real time, and from the second row a patron asked if the student in the photograph intended to speak, and Julian felt the room pivot toward him even though he wore the neutral badge of a volunteer. And he weighed the options and decided that hiding would make her stand alone in a way he could not accept. So he walked to the second aisle microphone and introduced himself by first name only and told the room that he was a political science student who worked part-time and kept his grades steady and that he did not owe anyone details about his relationships, but that he would confirm it to avoid dragging anyone else into conjecture, and he explained that no faculty member had ever used leverage or pressure on him and that he had no professional tie to the foundation and that he would not accept the idea that his adulthood ended at the doors of the auditorium, and he finished by saying that anyone who cared about safeguarding students should focus on abuses of power rather than the spectacle of consenting adults, and that if anyone wanted to have a conversation about policy he would show up and speak plainly. Questions chased them down the aisle as the panel concluded with a statement from the foundation director promising a review, and the donors divided into factions of concern, support, and calculated neutrality, and as the room emptied, Eva appeared at the back because she had come to see what her brother did at events and had arrived in time to watch the image and hear their words, and she hugged Julian and told Elena that she respected the courage it took to step into a room that did not offer fairness, and then she asked what they wanted to do next, and Elena said that the immediate step was to meet with the director and offer a transition plan if the board believed her presence would harm the foundation's work, and Julian said that he would accept the consequences at the university if any emerged because he would not let this moment rewrite the story of his work, and they walked out together under the eyes that followed, understanding that the choice they had made in public would require them to accept whatever came in the days ahead without retreating into silence. The first 24 hours after the conference felt longer than the week before it, because once the photographs had been posted online, they traveled quickly between platforms, paired with captions that ranged from speculation to criticism to cautious defense, and Elena spent the morning at the foundation drafting a statement that confirmed her resignation effective at the end of the month, explaining in formal language that she wanted to remove any distraction from the organization's work, while also making clear that the relationship had been private, consensual, and free of professional conflict. She delivered the statement to the board, answered questions about handover of projects, and declined to discuss her personal life further, leaving the meeting with a clear plan to close her role without letting anyone claim she had been forced out for misconduct. Julian spent that same morning answering 2 emails from the university's student affairs office requesting a meeting to clarify the nature of the relationship in light of the attention it had received, and he scheduled it for the following week, knowing that it was not an academic misconduct case but that public perception could still influence how administrators approached him. They met that evening in her apartment, and the mood was steady rather than frantic, because both of them knew the immediate damage had already been done and that their work now was to decide what came next. Elena told him that she felt the weight of losing a role she had built over 5 years but that she did not regret the choice to stand in the auditorium and speak for herself, and he told her that the way she had handled it had made him realize how much space there was between avoiding trouble and living without apology. They talked for hours about what each of them wanted beyond the immediate noise. There are some moments that don't announce themselves, that don't stand under spotlights or arrive with the predictable clink of wine glasses and formal introductions. They happen quietly, under the hum of air conditioning, or the dull chatter of strangers, and they stay. It was raining the afternoon Julian first saw her, though saw was the wrong word, because it wasn't just sight, it was the way his attention snagged on her the way a sleeve catches on a loose nail. He had been sitting in the corner of the café near campus, half listening to the hiss of the espresso machine, his laptop open to a paper he wasn't writing, when she walked in with her umbrella held at an awkward angle, her hair damp in that unbothered way that suggested she had stopped caring about appearances long before she stepped through the door. Her face was striking, but not in the polished, magazine-slick way. There was something unedited about her, as if life had left its handwriting in the faint lines around her eyes and the way she tilted her head when scanning for an empty table. Julian, 23, and in the middle of his own collection of half-lived years, found himself studying her without realizing he had stopped typing. She wore a navy trench coat, its belt loosely tied, and a pair of scuffed leather boots that looked as though they had weathered more than rain. He wondered if she was a professor, or maybe just passing through, because the café sat between the university and the part of town where people pretended their mortgages hadn't aged them. She sat by the window with a book and actual paper and ordered tea instead of coffee, which seemed almost like an act of rebellion in a place that reeked of espresso. She didn't glance at anyone. She didn't care to. It was the smallest thing that made him approach her, an accident, really. When he got up to leave, his bag strap caught on the chair beside her, sending her paper napkin fluttering to the floor. He picked it up before she could, and she looked at him then, a look not of gratitude but of curiosity, as if she were trying to measure the point of his interruption. She had brown eyes, warm but wary, like they had been taught too many times to expect the wrong thing. He handed her the napkin and said something so unremarkable he forgot it immediately, but she smiled, not the polite smile of strangers in shared space, but a small, crooked thing that looked like it had fought its way through a year of storms. That was the part that lodged itself in him, the way her expression shifted from guarded to almost unwillingly softened, as though she hadn't been given a reason to do it in a very long time. They didn't exchange names. Not then. But the next day he saw her again, in the same café, at the same table, with a different book. He nodded as he passed, and she nodded back, and something unspoken settled between them. On the third day, he broke the silence by making a comment about her book, something about how the author had been criticized for romanticizing loneliness. She looked at him like she was trying to decide if he meant it as a joke or an insult. "Some things," she said, "are worth romanticizing. Loneliness can be one of them." Her voice had a textured calm to it, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned to speak only when she had something worth saying. Over the next week, they talked in fragments. He learned her name, Elena, when she offered it in a way that suggested she didn't give it out easily. She learned his when he apologized for being late one afternoon, rain again dripping from his hair. She didn't ask what he studied, and he didn't ask what she did for work. Their conversations were about books, the weather, the absurdity of cafe playlists, and occasionally the kinds of things you only admit to strangers, things too sharp or strange to tell the people who think they know you. It was a Thursday when the moment came that would stay in him like a secret. She was reading when a group of loud students entered, filling the space with the entitled noise of people who had never considered the possibility of being alone. One of them, a tall boy with a laugh like breaking glass, noticed her and said something under his breath that made the others snicker. Julian heard it. So did she. She didn't look up, but he saw the way her shoulders tightened, the smallest bracing. Without thinking, he got up, walked over to the counter, and ordered a second tea, the same as hers. When it came, he set it in front of her without explanation, without looking at the group, and sat back down at his table as if that had been his plan all along. She stared